The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her gear one final time before stepping into what would become the most challenging day of her military career. At 24, she had already proven herself as one of the most skilled helicopter pilots in the Navy. But today was different. Today, she would meet the SEALs who would change everything she thought she knew about courage and precision. Sarah had earned her wings 3 years earlier, graduating at the top of her flight school class. Her instructors had noted something unusual about her flying style, an almost supernatural ability to read wind patterns and navigate through impossible conditions. She could thread a helicopter through spaces that seemed too narrow, land on surfaces that looked unstable, and extract teams from situations that other pilots wouldn't even attempt. Her fellow pilots had started calling her the Falcon because of the way she could swoop down, grab her target, and disappear before anyone knew what happened. The nickname had spread throughout the base, but Sarah had always thought it was just friendly banter among her squadron. She had no idea that her reputation had reached the ears of the most elite fighting force in the world. The SEALs had been watching her for months, studying her flight patterns, analyzing her decision-making under pressure, and waiting for the right moment to bring her into their world. Commander Jack Harrison had been leading SEAL Team 6 operations for over a decade. He had seen countless pilots come and go, but when he received Sarah's file, something caught his attention. Her mission success rate was perfect. Not just good, not just excellent, but literally perfect. In 3 years of active duty, she had never failed to complete an extraction, never lost a team member, and never backed down from a mission regardless of the conditions. The briefing room was filled with the usual pre-mission tension when Sarah walked in. She had been told this was a routine training exercise, a chance for her to work with special operations teams and expand her experience. The 12 SEALs seated around the table looked up as she entered, their faces showing the typical skepticism that special forces reserved for outsiders. They had worked with many pilots before, and most had cracked under the pressure of real combat situations. Lieutenant Commander Mike Torres was the first to speak. He had been with the teams for 8 years and had survived more close calls than he cared to remember. His last pilot had panicked during a hot extraction in Afghanistan, nearly getting the entire team killed before Torres had to take control of the aircraft himself. He wasn't looking forward to breaking in another rookie, especially one whose reputation seemed too good to be true. Sarah took her seat at the table and listened as Commander Harrison outlined the training scenario. They would be conducting a simulated hostage rescue in mountainous terrain, with multiple complications designed to test both the team's tactical skills and her ability to adapt under pressure. The weather forecast called for high winds and low visibility, conditions that had already caused 2 other training exercises to be postponed. As Harrison spoke, Sarah studied the topographical map spread across the table. The landing zone was barely large enough for a helicopter, surrounded by rocky outcroppings that would create dangerous downdrafts. The extraction point was even worse. A narrow ridge with a sheer drop on 3 sides and barely enough room for the aircraft's rotors to clear the surrounding peaks. She had flown in similar conditions before, but never with the added pressure of keeping a team of elite warriors alive. The SEALs began discussing their approach, using terminology and tactical concepts that Sarah had studied but never experienced firsthand. She listened quietly, absorbing their planning process and trying to understand how her role as pilot fit into their larger strategy. What struck her most was the level of detail they considered, not just the primary mission, but multiple backup plans, contingency routes, and abort procedures for every possible scenario. Sergeant First Class Danny Rodriguez had been skeptical about working with a female pilot, not because of her gender, but because he had never seen anyone, male or female, handle the kind of pressure they would be putting on her. His team had a saying, "The pilot is only as good as their worst day under fire." They had seen too many hotshot aviators fall apart when the bullets started flying and their perfect training scenarios became chaotic reality. As the briefing continued, Sarah began to realize that this wasn't just another training exercise. The level of preparation, the intensity in the room, and the way the SEALs discussed contingencies suggested something much more serious. She had heard rumors about teams being deployed on short notice, about training exercises that suddenly became real-world missions, but she had never been part of that world before. Commander Harrison concluded the briefing by explaining the communication protocols they would use during the mission. Each team member had specific call signs, backup frequencies, and emergency procedures that had been developed through years of combat experience. Sarah would be Falcon 6, a designation that made her realize the nickname she thought was casual had somehow made its way into official military documentation. The afternoon was spent in equipment checks and final preparations. Sarah walked around her aircraft, conducting the same pre-flight inspection she had done hundreds of times before. But everything felt different now. The helicopter that had always been her sanctuary, her place of control and confidence, suddenly seemed inadequate for what lay ahead. The SEALs moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of countless similar preparations, their gear organized with the precision that only came from knowing that a misplaced item could mean the difference between life and death. As the sun began to set, behind the mountains that would soon become their training ground, Sarah found herself questioning whether she was ready for this level of responsibility. She had always prided herself on her flying skills, but working with the SEALs meant that 12 lives would depend on her ability to perform flawlessly under conditions she had never faced before. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders as she made her final checks and prepared for a mission that would either prove she belonged in their world or end her career before it truly began. The helicopter blades cut through the mountain air as Sarah navigated through the narrow valley that led to the training area. Behind her, the 12 SEALs sat in focused silence, each man mentally reviewing his role in the upcoming operation. The late evening light cast eerie shadows across the rocky terrain below, and Sarah could feel the first hints of the challenging weather that was supposed to arrive within the hour. Commander Harrison's voice crackled through her headset as he provided updates from the Tactical Operations Center. The simulated hostage situation had been set up in an abandoned mining facility, nestled between two peaks, accessible only by helicopter due to the treacherous terrain. Intelligence reports indicated multiple hostile forces in the area, sophisticated anti-aircraft capabilities, and civilians whose safety depended on the team's ability to execute a perfect extraction. Sarah had studied the facility layout during their briefing, but seeing it from the air revealed complications that hadn't been apparent on paper. The primary landing zone was even smaller than she had expected, with power lines running along one side and a communications tower that would interfere with her rotor clearance. The backup landing zones were worse. One was on a slope that would make it nearly impossible to maintain stability, while the other was exposed to potential enemy fire from multiple directions. Lieutenant Commander Torres moved forward in the cabin, speaking into his headset as he coordinated with his team leaders. The SEALs had divided into 3 squads, each with specific objectives once they reached the ground. Alpha Squad would secure the perimeter and establish overwatch positions. Bravo would handle the actual hostage rescue, and Charlie would prepare the extraction route and ensure their escape path remained clear. As they approached the target area, Sarah noticed the weather beginning to deteriorate exactly as predicted. Wind gusts were increasing, and low clouds were starting to form around the mountain peaks. She adjusted her flight path to compensate for the changing conditions, using techniques she had learned during her mountain flying training, but had never applied in such a high-stakes environment. The first indication that something was wrong came from Sergeant Rodriguez, who was monitoring enemy communications through specialized equipment. The hostile forces they were supposed to encounter during the training exercise were using different radio frequencies than expected, and their movements suggested they had received advance warning about the SEAL operation. What was supposed to be a controlled training scenario was beginning to feel like something much more dangerous. Sarah's instruments started picking up radar signatures that shouldn't have been present in a training environment. Multiple aircraft were approaching their position from different directions, and their electronic signatures didn't match any friendly forces that should have been operating in the area. She immediately reported the contacts to Commander Harrison, who confirmed that no other military assets were supposed to be in their airspace. The realization hit the team simultaneously. This wasn't a training exercise anymore. Somehow their simulated hostage rescue had become a real-world operation, with actual hostile forces and genuine threats to American personnel. The abandoned mining facility wasn't empty after all, and the people they were supposed to rescue weren't actors playing roles in a military exercise. Commander Harrison's voice came through the radio with new urgency as he explained the situation. Intelligence had received last-minute information about American contractors who had been kidnapped while conducting geological surveys in the region. The contractors were being held at the same location the SEALs had chosen for their training exercise, and hostile forces in the area had somehow learned about the incoming American military operation. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the full implications became clear. She was no longer flying a routine training mission with experienced special forces. She was the primary extraction asset for a live, hostage rescue operation against unknown enemies with sophisticated weapons and advanced knowledge of their plans. Everything she had trained for was about to be tested under conditions that could result in real casualties and international consequences. The SEALs around her transformed from training participants into combat operators with frightening efficiency. Their casual conversation stopped, their equipment checks became more thorough, and their communication shifted to the clipped professional tone that Sarah had heard about, but never experienced firsthand. She watched in fascination as 12 individual soldiers became a single, coordinated fighting force. Sergeant Rodriguez reported that the hostile forces had at least 3 anti-aircraft missile systems positioned around the facility, along with multiple heavy machine gun positions and what appeared to be a sophisticated command and control setup. The enemy wasn't a ragtag group of criminals. They were well-equipped, professionally trained, and prepared for exactly the kind of operation the SEALs were about to attempt. Sarah found herself flying through increasingly difficult weather as the mountain winds picked up and visibility continued to decrease. The helicopter was being buffeted by gusts that threatened to slam them into the canyon walls, and she had to use every technique she had ever learned to keep them on course. Behind her, the SEALs were conducting final weapons checks and reviewing contingency plans that had suddenly become matters of life and death. The first hostile contact came sooner than expected. Sarah's threat warning system lit up as a surface-to-air missile locked onto their aircraft. She immediately initiated evasive maneuvers, throwing the helicopter into a steep dive that pressed everyone against their seats and tested the aircraft's structural limits. The missile streaked past them, close enough that they could see its exhaust trail through the cabin windows. Lieutenant Commander Torres was on the radio immediately, calling for backup and updating their tactical situation. The enemy had revealed their positions by firing on the incoming helicopter, but they had also demonstrated that this was no longer a training exercise with simulated threats. Real missiles were being fired at them, and Sarah's flying skills were all that stood between the team and a catastrophic crash in hostile territory. As they approached the target facility, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple weapons positions. The SEALs were about to fast rope into a hot landing zone while under direct enemy fire, relying on her ability to hold the aircraft steady despite the incoming rounds that were starting to impact their fuselage. The next few minutes would determine whether her reputation as the Falcon was based on genuine skill or simply good luck that was about to run out. Sarah brought the helicopter into a hover above the designated insertion point as enemy rounds pinged off the aircraft's armored hull. The landing zone was smaller than a basketball court, surrounded by rocky outcroppings and exposed to enemy fire from 3 different directions. She had to maintain perfect position control while the SEALs prepared to fast rope down into what had become a genuine combat situation. Commander Harrison was the first out the door, sliding down the thick rope with practiced ease despite the helicopter swaying in the mountain winds. Sarah fought to keep the aircraft steady as more SEALs followed, each man disappearing into the darkness below where muzzle flashes indicated ongoing enemy activity. Her instruments showed multiple warnings as small arms fire continued to strike the helicopter, but none of the hits had damaged critical systems yet. Lieutenant Commander Torres was coordinating the insertion over the radio while simultaneously preparing his own equipment. The plan had been complicated enough when it was just a training exercise, but now they were dealing with unknown enemy strength, real hostages whose lives hung in the balance, and weather conditions that were continuing to deteriorate. Sarah could see storm clouds building around the mountain peaks, promising even worse flying conditions in the near future. Sergeant Rodriguez was the last SEAL out of the aircraft, but before he disappeared down the rope, he made eye contact with Sarah and gave her a thumbs up. It was a simple gesture, but it conveyed more confidence than any words could have expressed. The SEALs trusted her to be there when they needed extraction, regardless of what they encountered on the ground or what the weather threw at them. As soon as the last rope was clear, Sarah pulled the helicopter away from the insertion point and began flying a holding pattern while monitoring the team's radio communications. The SEALs were moving quickly through the facility, encountering more resistance than expected, but adapting their tactics with the flexibility that came from years of combat experience. She could hear the tension in their voices as they reported enemy positions and updated their assessment of the tactical situation. Alpha Squad had established overwatch positions on the surrounding ridges, but they were reporting at least 30 enemy fighters in the area, far more than the intelligence estimates had suggested. The hostile forces weren't just well-equipped. They were professionally trained and fighting with the coordination of a military unit, rather than a criminal organization. Commander Harrison's voice came over the radio with updates that painted an increasingly dangerous picture. Bravo Squad had located the hostages in an underground section of the mining facility, but getting to them required moving through a series of tunnels that were heavily defended. The enemy had prepared for exactly this kind of rescue operation, with interlocking fields of fire, improvised explosive devices, and communication systems that allowed them to coordinate their defense effectively. What should have been a quick snatch-and-grab operation was turning into a prolonged firefight. Sarah found herself flying in increasingly challenging conditions as the mountain weather continued to worsen. Wind gusts were approaching the limits of what the helicopter could handle, and visibility was dropping as fog began to form in the valleys. She had to use night vision equipment to navigate between the peaks, relying on instruments and her understanding of mountain flying to avoid controlled flight into terrain. The radio chatter from the ground team indicated that the situation was becoming more complicated by the minute. Charlie Squad had secured the primary extraction point, but enemy forces were moving to surround their position. The SEALs needed to complete the hostage rescue and get out of the area before they were overwhelmed by superior numbers. Sarah knew that when the extraction call came, she would have only minutes to get the helicopter into position and get everyone out safely. Commander Harrison's voice came over the radio with an update that changed everything. The intelligence team had identified the enemy force as a well-funded terrorist organization with connections to several nation-states. The American contractors hadn't been kidnapped for ransom. They possessed geological survey data that revealed valuable mineral deposits in the region. The terrorists planned to use the information to fund future operations, making this rescue mission critical to national security. The weather was becoming a major factor as Sarah continued her holding pattern. Ice was starting to form on the helicopter's windscreen, and turbulence was making it difficult to maintain stable flight. She had to constantly adjust power settings and flight controls to compensate for the changing conditions, while simultaneously monitoring the tactical situation on the ground and preparing for what would likely be a very challenging extraction under fire. Bravo Squad reported that they had reached the hostages, but the situation was worse than anyone had anticipated. 3 American contractors were being held in a heavily fortified underground chamber, but 2 of them had been injured during their captivity and would require medical attention during the extraction. The team would need additional time to prepare the wounded for transport. Time they didn't have as enemy reinforcements continued to arrive in the area. Sarah realized that the standard extraction procedures wouldn't work in this situation. The combination of wounded hostages, overwhelming enemy forces, deteriorating weather, and challenging terrain meant that she would need to improvise tactics that weren't covered in any training manual. She began studying the topographical map on her flight display, looking for alternative extraction points that might give the team better options. Lieutenant Commander Torres came over the radio with a request that sent chills down Sarah's spine. The team needed her to conduct a close air support mission, using the helicopter's mounted weapons to suppress enemy positions while the SEALs moved the hostages to an alternate extraction point. She had trained for such missions, but had never conducted them in actual combat, especially not in weather conditions that made precision flying extremely difficult. As she maneuvered the helicopter into attack position, Sarah could see enemy fighters moving through the facility below. They were well organized and heavily armed with weapon systems that posed a serious threat to her aircraft. She would have to fly low and slow to provide effective fire support, making herself a target for every enemy weapon in the area. While the SEALs counted on her accuracy, to avoid hitting friendly forces. The next few minutes would test every skill she had developed as a pilot and determine whether she truly deserved the reputation that had brought her to this moment. The SEALs on the ground were depending on her precision, the hostages were depending on her courage, and her own survival depended on her ability to fly better than she ever had before. Sarah dove the helicopter toward the target facility, her weapon systems coming online as she prepared to provide close air support for the SEALs below. The enemy positions were clearly marked on her tactical display, but she had to be incredibly precise to avoid hitting the underground chambers where her own people were operating. One mistake with the helicopter's mounted machine. Guns could kill the very people she was trying to save. The first attack run required her to fly between two rocky spires while maintaining a steady firing solution on an enemy machine gun nest that was pinning down Alpha Squad. Sarah felt the helicopter shudder as return fire struck the aircraft, but she held her course until her own weapons had silenced the enemy position. The precision required was unlike anything she had ever attempted, made even more challenging by the deteriorating weather conditions. Commander Harrison's voice came over the radio with updates that painted a desperate picture. Bravo Squad had successfully reached the hostages, but two of the American contractors were in worse condition than initially reported. One had a serious leg injury that would make movement difficult, while the other was showing signs of internal bleeding that required immediate medical attention. The team medic was doing what he could, but they needed to get the wounded men to a proper medical facility as soon as possible. Sarah completed her second attack run, destroying an enemy communication position that had been coordinating the terrorist response. The explosion lit up the mountainside and revealed just how many enemy fighters were converging on the facility. She could see at least 50 hostile personnel moving through the area, far more than the 12 SEALs could handle in a prolonged firefight. The extraction had to happen soon, or the team would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The weather was becoming a critical factor as ice continued to form on the helicopter's surfaces and visibility dropped to dangerous levels. Sarah had to rely increasingly on her instruments and night vision equipment to navigate between the mountain peaks, while simultaneously providing fire support and preparing for what would be an extremely challenging extraction under combat conditions. Her fuel was also becoming a concern, as the aggressive maneuvering and extended hover time had consumed more than expected. Lieutenant Commander Torres reported that they were ready to move to the alternate extraction point, but the route would take them through an area that was heavily defended by enemy forces. The SEALs would need continuous air support to fight their way through, while Sarah would have to fly at extremely low altitude to provide effective cover fire. The margin for error was essentially zero. Any mistake would result in casualties among both the hostages and the rescue team. Sarah began her next series of attack runs, systematically destroying enemy positions along the route the SEALs would use to reach the extraction point. Each attack required her to fly between obstacles that left only inches of clearance for her rotor blades, while enemy tracers streaked past the helicopter and occasional hits sent vibrations through the airframe. She had never flown so aggressively or in such dangerous conditions, but the lives of 15 people depended on her precision. Sergeant Rodriguez came over the radio with an update that added another layer of complexity to the situation. The enemy forces had brought up additional anti-aircraft missiles and were positioning them to cover the planned extraction point. Sarah would need to conduct her extraction approach while evading sophisticated surface-to-air missiles, all while maintaining the stability necessary to load wounded personnel under fire. It was a tactical problem that seemed almost impossible to solve. The SEALs began their movement toward the extraction point, carrying the two wounded hostages, while the third contractor moved under his own power despite his ordeal. Sarah provided overwatch from above, using her weapons to suppress enemy positions as they were revealed by muzzle flashes in the darkness. The coordination required between air and ground forces was extraordinary, with split-second timing determining the difference between success and disaster. As the team approached the extraction point, Sarah could see that the enemy had anticipated their movement. Heavy weapons were positioned to cover the landing zone, and at least 2 missile teams were setting up to engage her aircraft when she came in for the pickup. She would need to neutralize these threats before she could safely approach the extraction point, but doing so would require flying directly into the most dangerous part of the enemy defensive position. Commander Harrison's voice crackled through her headset with an urgent update. Intelligence was reporting that additional enemy forces were en route to the area, including aircraft that could arrive within the next 30 minutes. The window for extraction was closing rapidly, and they would need to complete the rescue before enemy air assets arrived, and made helicopter operations impossible in the confined mountain terrain. Sarah made the decision to conduct what military aviators call a danger-close attack run, firing her weapons at enemy positions that were within dangerous proximity to friendly forces. The technique required absolute precision and perfect communication with the ground team, as even small errors could result in friendly fire casualties. She had practiced such attacks in training, but had never attempted them in actual combat with lives hanging in the balance. The attack run was successful, destroying the missile positions and clearing the way for extraction, but it came at a cost. Sarah's helicopter had taken multiple hits and warning lights were illuminating across her instrument panel. The aircraft was still flyable, but she wasn't sure how much more damage it could sustain. Fuel was also becoming critical, with just enough remaining for one extraction attempt and the flight back to base. As she positioned the helicopter for the pickup, Sarah could see the SEALs moving toward the landing zone while carrying their wounded. Enemy forces were closing in from multiple directions, and the extraction would need to be completed quickly before the team was overrun. The weather had deteriorated to the point where ice was affecting the helicopter's performance, and visibility was so poor that she was operating almost entirely on instruments. The moment had arrived when everything Sarah had trained for would be tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The SEALs were depending on her to execute a perfect extraction under fire, in terrible weather with a damaged aircraft, while enemy forces closed in from all sides. Her reputation as the Falcon had brought her to this point, but only her skill and courage would determine whether everyone made it home alive. Sarah brought the helicopter into a steep approach toward the extraction point, as enemy fire intensified around them. The landing zone was barely large enough for the aircraft, with rocky outcroppings on 3 sides and a sheer drop on the 4th. She had to maintain perfect control while bullets shattered the windscreen and warning alarms sounded throughout the cockpit. The damaged helicopter was fighting her every input, but she managed to bring it to a hover just feet above the ground. Commander Harrison was the first to reach the aircraft, helping to load the most seriously wounded hostage into the cabin, while his team provided covering fire. The man was unconscious and bleeding, requiring careful handling that took precious seconds they didn't have. Sarah held the helicopter steady despite the enemy fire that was coming closer with each passing moment, her hands gripping the controls with determination. That surprised even her. Lieutenant Commander Torres was directing the loading while simultaneously coordinating defensive fire with his remaining team members. The enemy forces had closed to within 100 meters and were advancing under cover of heavy weapons fire that was chewing up the ground around the helicopter. Sarah could see tracer rounds passing between the rotor blades, close enough that she could feel the heat from their passage. The second wounded hostage presented even more challenges, as his leg injury made it difficult to get him into the aircraft quickly. Sergeant Rodriguez and 2 other SEALs had to lift him carefully while under fire, a process that exposed them to enemy shooters for longer than anyone was comfortable with. Sarah maintained her hover despite multiple impacts to the aircraft's fuselage, praying that none of the rounds would strike something critical. As the last hostage was loaded into the cabin, Sarah realized they had a serious problem. The helicopter was now carrying 15 people plus equipment, well over its normal capacity for high-altitude operations. The thin mountain air and damaged systems meant that she would have barely enough power to get airborne, let alone climb out of the valley while under fire. The laws of physics were working against them at the worst possible moment. Commander Harrison made the decision that would haunt him for years afterward. 2 of his SEALs would have to stay behind to make room for the hostages, conducting a fighting withdrawal on foot, while the helicopter escaped with the rescued civilians. The men who volunteered knew they were facing almost certain capture or death, but they made the choice without hesitation, because that's what SEALs do for each other and for the mission. Sarah felt sick as she watched the 2 operators disappear into the darkness, their sacrifice allowing her to lift off with a helicopter that was barely controllable and dangerously overloaded. The aircraft struggled to gain altitude as enemy forces directed concentrated fire at the departing aircraft. Multiple systems were failing, fuel was critically low, and the weather conditions were continuing to deteriorate. but somehow they were airborne and climbing away from the immediate danger. The flight back to base became a nightmare of mechanical problems and weather challenges that tested every skill Sarah possessed as a pilot. Ice was forming on the rotor blades, affecting their aerodynamic efficiency and causing dangerous vibrations throughout the aircraft. The engine was running rough, possibly damaged by enemy fire, and she had to nurse it carefully to prevent a complete failure that would send them crashing into the mountainous terrain below. One of the wounded hostages went into medical crisis during the flight, his condition deteriorating rapidly due to internal injuries that were beyond the team medic's ability to treat in the back of a damaged helicopter. Sarah pushed the aircraft harder than she should have, knowing that every minute of delay reduced the man's chances of survival. The SEALs worked frantically to stabilize him while she flew through weather that should have grounded all aircraft hours earlier. Lieutenant Commander Torres was on the radio constantly, coordinating with search and rescue teams that were being dispatched to locate the two SEALs who had stayed behind. The men had gone silent on their radios, suggesting they were either captured, killed, or hiding from enemy forces while attempting to evade and escape. The successful rescue of the hostages was overshadowed by the knowledge that American warriors might be paying the ultimate price. For the mission's success, Sarah's fuel situation became critical as they approached the base. With gauges showing levels that barely registered above empty, she had to choose between landing at the nearest airfield or continuing to the medical facility where the wounded hostages could receive proper treatment. The decision was made for her when the engine began showing signs of imminent failure, forcing an emergency landing at a small forward operating base that had minimal medical facilities. The landing was rough but successful, with emergency crews rushing to meet the helicopter as it touched down. The wounded hostages were immediately transferred to medical personnel who had been standing by, while the SEALs began the painful process of accounting for their missing team members. Sarah shut down the damaged aircraft and sat in the cockpit for several minutes, trying to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. Commander Harrison found her sitting alone in the helicopter, staring at the bullet holes that covered the windscreen and instrument panel. He had seen many pilots after their first real combat mission, and he recognized the signs of someone who was struggling to come to terms with the reality of war. Sarah had performed magnificently under impossible conditions, but the cost of success was weighing heavily on her conscience. The debriefing that followed revealed the full scope of what they had accomplished and what it had cost. The 3 American contractors were alive because of Sarah's flying and the SEALs' courage, but 2 elite warriors were missing in enemy territory and presumed captured or killed. The geological survey data they had been trying to protect was recovered, preventing it from falling into terrorist hands, but the price had been higher than anyone wanted to pay. As reports filtered in from intelligence sources, the team learned that their missing SEALs had managed to evade capture and were conducting a fighting withdrawal toward friendly territory. A massive search and rescue operation was being organized to locate and extract them, but their situation remained desperate. Sarah volunteered immediately to fly the rescue mission, despite her helicopter being out of commission and her own emotional state following the traumatic events. The military hierarchy was impressed by Sarah's performance under fire, but they were also concerned about the psychological impact of her first combat mission. She had saved lives through exceptional flying, but she had also witnessed the reality that sometimes winning required sacrifices that were almost too painful to accept. The nickname, the Falcon, had taken on a new meaning. She wasn't just skilled, she was proven in combat under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Sarah spent the next 72 hours in a state of restless anxiety as search and rescue operations continued for the 2 missing SEALs. Every available aircraft was involved in the effort, scanning the mountainous terrain for any sign of Petty Officer Jake Sullivan and Petty Officer Marcus Chen, the 2 operators who had sacrificed their seats on the extraction helicopter to save the hostages. Sarah had requested repeatedly to join the search flights, but her superiors had grounded her pending psychological evaluation and aircraft reassignment. The intelligence reports painted a grim picture of the situation on the ground. Enemy forces were conducting systematic sweeps of the area where the SEALs were last known to be operating, using helicopters, ground vehicles, and tracking dogs to hunt for the missing Americans. The terrorists knew that capturing Navy SEALs alive would be a significant propaganda victory. giving them leverage for prisoner exchanges and media attention that could advance their cause internationally. Commander Harrison visited Sarah in her quarters on the third day, bringing news that changed everything. Satellite imagery had detected what appeared to be a signal mirror, flashing from a remote canyon approximately 15 miles from the original extraction site. The pattern matched SEAL emergency communication protocols, suggesting that at least one of the missing operators was still alive and attempting to contact friendly forces. The problem was that the location was deep in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces, and accessible only by helicopter. Sarah looked up from the intelligence photographs spread across her desk, her eyes showing a mixture of hope and determination that Harrison recognized from his own early combat experiences. She had been studying topographical maps of the search area for hours, plotting potential flight routes and extraction points that might allow a rescue helicopter to reach the isolated canyon where their people might be hiding. Her flying skills were legendary, but this mission would require her to exceed even her own previous accomplishments. The rescue mission briefing revealed why Sarah's unique abilities would be essential for any chance of success. The canyon where the signal had been detected was barely wide enough for a helicopter's rotor disc, surrounded by vertical rock walls that rose over 300 feet on both sides. The approach would require threading the aircraft through a narrow opening between peaks, then descending straight down into the canyon, while maintaining precise control in the turbulent air that would be bouncing off the rock walls. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the mission commander, had reviewed Sarah's flight records and spoken with every pilot she had ever served with. The consensus was unanimous. If anyone could execute such a technically demanding rescue under combat conditions, it would be Sarah Mitchell. Her reputation for precision flying had grown beyond just her squadron, reaching the highest levels of Special Operations Command, where her performance during the hostage rescue had been noted by senior military leaders. The aircraft assigned to the mission was a specially modified helicopter equipped with advanced navigation systems, defensive countermeasures, and extended fuel tanks that would allow for the long flight into enemy territory. Sarah conducted her pre-flight inspection with the methodical thoroughness that had become her trademark, knowing that mechanical failure during this mission would likely mean death for both the rescue team and the missing SEALs they were trying to save. The rescue team consisted of 6 SEALs from the same unit as the missing operators, men who had served with Sullivan and Chen for years and were determined to bring their teammates home. Sergeant First Class Mike Kowalski had been Sullivan's swim buddy during Bud's training and had served with him on 4 combat deployments. The personal nature of the mission added emotional weight that everyone felt, but nobody discussed openly. Weather conditions for the rescue flight were marginal at best, with cloud cover that would provide concealment from enemy aircraft, but also make navigation challenging in the mountainous terrain. Sarah would be flying primarily on instruments through areas where radar altimeters might not function properly due to the steep terrain and electronic interference from enemy jamming, equipment that intelligence had detected throughout the region. The flight to the target area took nearly 2 hours, with Sarah navigating through valleys and passes that she had never seen before, while maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. The helicopter's defensive systems detected multiple radar signatures from enemy air defense sites, but none had locked onto their aircraft yet. Sarah used every technique she had learned about low-level flight to stay beneath the enemy radar coverage, while maintaining enough altitude to clear the mountain peaks. As they approached the canyon, where the signal had been detected, Sarah could see why this location had been chosen as a hiding place. The narrow gorge was invisible from above and accessible only through a twisting approach that would challenge even the most experienced mountain pilot. Enemy forces were visible on the surrounding ridges, but they appeared to be focused on other areas and hadn't yet discovered the canyon entrance that concealed their missing teammates. The descent into the canyon required Sarah to fly in a controlled fall, using the rock walls to shield the helicopter from detection, while simultaneously fighting the turbulent air that threatened to slam them into the canyon sides. She had practiced similar maneuvers during mountain warfare training, but never under combat conditions with lives hanging in the balance. Every control input had to be perfect, as there was no room for error in the confined space. Halfway down the canyon wall, Sarah spotted movement in the rocks below that made her heart race with relief and concern. 2 figures were waving from a small ledge, but one appeared to be supporting the other in a way that suggested serious injury. The missing SEALs were alive, but their condition was unknown, and their position would make extraction extremely challenging even under ideal circumstances. Petty Officer Sullivan was supporting Petty Officer Chen, who had sustained a leg injury during their escape and evasion that had slowed their movement significantly. They had been hiding in the canyon for 3 days, surviving on emergency rations while enemy forces searched for them throughout the surrounding area. The signal mirror Sarah had seen was their last attempt to contact friendly forces before their situation became completely hopeless. Sarah maneuvered the helicopter into a hover next to the ledge where the SEALs were waiting, but the space was so confined that the rotor wash was creating dangerous downdrafts that threatened to destabilize the aircraft. The rescue team would have to work quickly to extract their teammates before the helicopter became uncontrollable in the turbulent air conditions created by the close proximity to the canyon walls. Sergeant Kowalski was the first out of the aircraft, rappelling down to the ledge where his teammates were waiting. Chen's leg injury was worse than it had appeared from above, requiring careful handling to avoid further damage during the extraction. Sullivan was exhausted but uninjured, having spent 3 days carrying his wounded teammate while evading enemy patrols that had come within meters of their hiding place. The extraction process was complicated by the confined space and Chen's condition, requiring the rescue team to use specialized equipment to lift him into the helicopter, while Sarah maintained a perfect hover in conditions that would have challenged any pilot. Enemy forces were beginning to investigate the helicopter noise echoing through the canyon system, adding time pressure to an already technically demanding operation. As the last SEAL was pulled into the aircraft, Sarah began the dangerous ascent out of the canyon, while enemy forces converged on their location. Radio intercepts indicated that hostile forces had identified their position and were moving heavy weapons to positions where they could engage the helicopter as it climbed toward the canyon rim. The next few minutes would determine whether the rescue mission succeeded or became a catastrophe that claimed even more American lives. Sarah pushed the helicopter to its limits as she climbed toward safety, using every technique she had learned about defensive flying while carrying a full load in thin mountain air. The aircraft was struggling to gain altitude quickly enough to avoid the enemy weapons being positioned to intercept them, but somehow she managed to clear the canyon rim, just as the first enemy rounds began impacting the rocks below their position. The flight back to base became a race against time, as Petty Officer Chen's condition deteriorated rapidly during the return journey. The SEAL medic worked frantically in the back of the helicopter while Sarah pushed the aircraft beyond its normal performance limits, knowing that every minute of delay reduced Chen's chances of survival. His leg wound had become infected during the 3 days of hiding in the mountains, and he was showing signs of sepsis that required immediate surgical intervention. Sarah's radio crackled with updates from the base medical team, who were preparing for a critically wounded patient and coordinating with trauma surgeons who had been flown in specifically for this case. The information she provided about Chen's condition allowed the medical team to prepare blood products and surgical equipment, but they emphasized that time was the critical factor in determining whether the wounded SEAL would survive his ordeal. As they approached friendly airspace, Sarah received word that enemy aircraft were scrambling to intercept them before they could reach safety. Intelligence indicated that the terrorists had called in favors from hostile nation-states who were providing air support in an attempt to prevent the rescued SEALs from providing information about enemy operations in the region. Sarah would have to outfly military jets while carrying a full load of passengers and flying a helicopter that was never designed for air-to-air combat. The first enemy aircraft appeared on Sarah's threat warning system as they crossed into contested airspace, but friendly fighter jets were already moving to intercept the hostile planes before they could engage the rescue helicopter. The next few minutes became a complex dance of military aircraft, as Sarah navigated through an aerial battlefield while trying to reach the medical facility where Chen could receive the treatment he desperately needed. Lieutenant Commander Torres, who was monitoring Chen's condition, reported that the wounded SEAL was losing consciousness and his vital signs were becoming unstable. The infection was spreading faster than the medic could treat it with the limited supplies available in the helicopter, making it clear that they had only minutes to reach definitive medical care. Sarah made the decision to conduct an emergency landing at the nearest medical facility, even though it meant exposing the helicopter to potential enemy ground fire. The emergency landing was conducted under combat conditions, with friendly forces providing security, while medical personnel rushed to meet the helicopter. Chen was transferred to the trauma team within seconds of touchdown, beginning a medical effort that would continue for hours as surgeons fought to save his life and his leg. Sarah remained with the aircraft, coordinating with maintenance crews who were assessing the damage sustained during the rescue mission. Commander Harrison found Sarah in the hospital waiting room several hours later, where she had been sitting quietly while Chen underwent emergency surgery. The rescued hostages from the previous mission had recovered fully and were providing intelligence that had already led to successful operations against the terrorist network. Sullivan was being debriefed by intelligence officers, giving them detailed information about enemy positions and capabilities that would be crucial for future missions. The medical team emerged from surgery with news that Chen would survive, although his leg injury would require additional operations and extensive rehabilitation. The quick medical intervention had prevented the infection from becoming life-threatening, but his career as a Navy SEAL was likely over due to the permanent damage to his leg. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sadness, knowing that she had saved his life but unable to prevent the end of his military service. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself processing the emotional impact of her first combat missions and the responsibility that came with flying rescue operations where lives hung in the balance. The two missions had tested every skill she possessed as a pilot and had revealed aspects of military service that training exercises could never fully prepare someone for. The nickname the Falcon had evolved from a reference to her flying skills into recognition of her performance under the most extreme combat conditions. The official debriefings revealed the full scope of what had been accomplished during the two rescue missions. 5 American lives had been saved. Critical intelligence had been recovered, and a terrorist network had been disrupted through the information provided by the rescued personnel. The cost had been significant: damaged aircraft, wounded personnel, and the psychological impact on everyone involved, but the missions were considered successful by every measure that mattered to the military leadership. Word of Sarah's performance began to spread throughout the special operations community, reaching pilots and aircrew members who understood the technical difficulty of what she had accomplished. Flying precision missions under combat conditions in challenging weather, with damaged aircraft while carrying wounded personnel, was the kind of performance that created legends in military aviation. Her reputation evolved from being a skilled pilot to being someone who could be counted on when everything went wrong. Commander Harrison recommended Sarah for several military decorations recognizing her heroism and exceptional flying during the rescue missions. More importantly, from a career perspective, he also recommended her for assignment to the most elite helicopter units in the military, organizations that only accepted pilots who had proven themselves under actual combat conditions. The training exercise that had become a real mission had changed the trajectory of Sarah's entire military career. 6 months later, Sarah found herself assigned to a classified unit that conducted the most sensitive rescue and insertion missions for special operations forces around the world. Her fellow pilots were all combat veterans who had earned their positions through exceptional performance under fire, and she had become the youngest pilot ever accepted into their ranks. The name Falcon had followed her to the new assignment, but now it carried the weight of proven combat performance rather than just training excellence. Years later, when other pilots asked about the origin of her nickname, Sarah would tell them about the missions that had tested everything she thought she knew about flying and courage. The reason the SEALs had been stunned by her performance wasn't just her technical flying skills. It was her ability to make life-and-death decisions under pressure while maintaining the precision required to save lives. She had earned the right to be called the Falcon through actions that would be remembered and retold throughout the special operations community for decades to come.